Good morning, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends. It's my great honor and pleasure to welcome you to today's very special conference. This year marks, as you have seen, the 50th anniversary Golden Jubilee of Korea Foundation for Advanced Studies. In Korea, they're saying that 10년이면 강산도 변한다. Even rivers and mountains change in 10 years. In that sense, we can proudly say KFAS has managed to survive 5-time change of transformation of mountain and rivers. With that aside, this is indeed a monumental moment and also a very proud moment. Besides being president of KFAS, I am myself proud recipient of KFAS scholarship, as some of you are in this hall. So words cannot describe how proud I am and you be able to showcase this conference to commemorate the Golden Jubilee. There's always remarkable visionary behind remarkable history. As you have seen, back in 1974, late Chairman Choi Jong-hyun of Seongyang Group at that time established a foundation out of his pocket expense, firmly based on philosophy, the nurturing world-class scholars in social science, humanities, and basic natural science is going to be key to establish world-leading nations. Chairman Choi gave his unwavering and unprecedented financial and emotional support. Under his wing, foundation took off, kicking start various types of scholars program, as you've seen in this video. When Chairman Choi unfortunately untimely passed away, his spirit and philosophy were inherited to our current chairman. If Chairman Choi Jong-hyun nurtured world-class scholars in attempt to Korea make world leading nation, it is our current chairman Choi Tae-won who truly made foundation global. In addition to traditional scholarship program, our foundation implemented various and global international exchange program in order to nurture global leaders aligned with the global eras to meet with test of our times. At the same time, we didn't forget late Chairman Choi's paid forward philosophy. As you have seen in this video and also as vividly in display our conference hall, lobby hall, you can have a chance to look around our activity and our achievements so far. So without both chairmen's vision and unwavering support, foundation could not have survived test of time for the past 50 years. To commemorate our Golden Jubilee, we have chosen topic of liberal democracy among many other issues. At the end of the Korean War, General Douglas MacArthur, the commander of UN forces, his quote is saying that, quote, "It will take dumb Koreans 100 years to recover from the devastation," unquote. Around the same time, 1951, in the middle of Korean War, the British newspaper Times ran a condescending editorial claiming that, quote, "It will be more reasonable to expect find roses growing on the garbage heap than a healthy democracy rising out of ruins of Korea," unquote. But fortunately for us, both predictions were proven wrong. From ashes of war and from colonial legacy, Korea has risen to economic powerhouse and thriving liberal democracy. So it is a remarkable journey for a country who on receiving end of aid and to giving end of donors. Must be inspirational example to many developing countries. Having said that, the challenge in front of us is even more serious, the challenge we were forced to undertake. Despite amazing, astonishing material success in such a short period of time, if you look around Korean society and globe, we are suffering from many divides: ideological divide, regional divide, generation divide, and even new gender divide. Without confronting these challenges, success we are enjoying now would not be sustainable, may not be inherited to next generations. So today's conference theme, as you see, is a century of liberal democracy, looking back 50 years, looking beyond next 50 years. We brought together renowned scholars from United States, Korea, and Europe, but also, as you see in this program, the student leaders who will be responsible to create better future for us. Chairman Choi Jong-hyun once said, while Korea is a war-torn poor country, we are trying to modernize the economy. The day will come when we enter the top-tier nations. By then, we'll confront new set of problems. We need intellectual capital to solve them. I think the time has come. So with scholars KFES helped to create, with the global network KFES has to establish, I think it's high time to tackle these challenges. So in closing, I hope today's conference leave you some lingering thought, especially for citizens and younger generation in this room. KFES will always stand true to founding philosophy by nurturing world-class scholars and future leaders. Thank you very much.
안녕하십니까. 산업통상자원부 장관 안덕근입니다. 지난 반세기 동안 세계적인 인재 양성을 통해 대한민국 발전에 기여해온 한국고등교육재단 창립 50주년을 진심으로 축하드립니다. 오늘 자유민주주의의 과거와 미래를 논의하기 위해 세계적인 석학들께서 먼 길을 오셨습니다. 냉전의 종식을 자유민주주의의 승리라고 선언하신 프랜시스 후쿠야마 교수님과 마이클 맥포울 교수님, 레리 다이아몬드 교수님, 다니엘레 까라마니 교수님, 신기욱 교수님을 비롯하여 오늘 참석하신 모든 분들께 깊은 감사 말씀드립니다. 그리고 뜻깊은 행사를 마련해 주신 한국고등교육재단의 최병일 사무총장님과 관계자 여러분들께도 감사의 말씀을 드립니다. 지금 세계는 미중 패권 경쟁, 지정학적 갈등, 공급망 분절화로 인해 정치적, 경제적 불확실성이 확대되면서 자유민주주의와 시장경제가 위협받고 있습니다. 이러한 상황에서 자유민주주의 100년, 지난 50년을 돌아보고 향후 50년을 전망하는 오늘 컨퍼런스는 매우 큰 의미가 있습니다. 지난 50년의 세계 역사는 자유민주주의의 승리이자 시장경제의 우월함을 확인하는 시간이었습니다. 저는 대한민국이 이를 증명하는 대표적인 국가라고 생각합니다. 대한민국은 치열한 민주화 운동을 통해 민주주의 가치를 사회에 뿌리내렸고 자유무역 체제하에서 지난한 시장 개방 과정을 통해 세계 10위권의 경제 강국으로 발전하였습니다. 자유민주주의가 시장 경제의 발전으로 선순환하는 모델을 보여준 것입니다. 한국고등교육재단은 이 과정에서 인재 양성에 힘쓰면서 재단의 1호 장학생으로 한국민주주의연구의 초석을 다진 최장집 고려대 명예교수님, 게임 이론의 권위자이신 조인구 미국 에모리 교수님, 한국인 최초 IMF 아태국장을 역임하신 이창용 한국은행 총재님 같이 각자의 분야에서 권위자로 인정받는 학자들을 다수 배출하며 대한민국의 정치, 경제 발전에 큰 기여를 해왔습니다. 오늘 이 자리에도 많은 장학생들이 참여해 주셨습니다. 저도 영광스럽게도 재단의 장학생으로 선발되어 미시간 대학교 로스쿨에서 유학을 했습니다. WTO 체제와 선진 통상법을 공부하면서 새로운 깨달음을 얻었고 그 경험을 바탕으로 오늘 이 자리에 설 수 있게 되었습니다. 내외 귀빈 여러분, 앞서 말씀드렸듯이 최근 자유민주주의와 시장경제가 후퇴하는 여러 징후들이 나타나고 있습니다. 경제적 불평등과 사회적 양극화, 포퓰리즘과 권위주의가 자유민주주의와 시장경제를 위협하고 있습니다. 정치 이념과 지정학적 이해관계에 따라 국가들 사이에 편가르기가 심화되고 있고 국가 간 갈등을 조정하는 국제기구들도 힘을 잃어가고 있습니다. 특히 WTO 체제는 자국 우선주의로 기능이 마비되고 있는 실정입니다. 우리는 자유민주주의와 자유무역의 가치 회복을 통해 파편화되고 갈라진 세계 경제를 안정적이고 지속 가능하게 만들어야 합니다. 한국 정부는 자유민주주의 가치를 공유하는 동맹국과 연대와 협력을 공고히 하고 WTO를 비롯한 국제기구의 기능 회복에도 적극 참여하면서 자유민주주의와 시장 경제 회복에 앞장서 노력하고 있습니다. 이를 통해 세계가 직면하고 있는 기후위기, 공급망 분절과 같은 다양한 도전 과제를 해결하는 데 적극 기여하고 있습니다. 내외 귀빈 여러분, 요즘 AI 시대라고 하지만 인류가 당면한 수많은 문제들은 언제나 시대를 앞서가는 훌륭한 인재들이 해결해 왔습니다. 현 세대가 냉전의 종식, 자유무역의 확산, 빈곤의 감축을 통해 자유민주주의와 시장경제를 확립해 왔듯이 우리의 후손들도 오늘의 어려운 도전에 대해 위기를 기회로 만들고 자유민주주의와 시장경제를 더 발전시켜 나갈 것으로 믿습니다. 이를 위해서는 우리 미래를 이끌어갈 인재 양성이 무엇보다 중요합니다. 교육을 통해 민주주의 본질과 정신을 계승하고 발전시켜 나가야 합니다. 역사의 교훈과 올바른 지식이 쌓이고 쌓일 때 우리 후손들도 자유민주주의의 진정한 가치를 누릴 수 있을 것입니다. 최종현 선대 회장님의 100년을 내다보며 인재를 키운다는 신념으로 탄생한 한국고등교육재단입니다. 재단 창립 50주년을 다시 한번 진심으로 축하드리며 앞으로 더욱 눈부신 재단의 창립 100주년을 기대하겠습니다. 감사합니다.
Welcome to the very first session. First session, I have honor of inviting and welcoming renowned scholars Francis FUKUYAMA. I think Francis has been in this podium some time ago, so this is not strange ground for you. So session is titled "The Century of Liberal Democracy," because he is the one will be always associated with the end of history. So before I was coming to this conference hall, the very renowned Korean ambassador Jo Byung-il, he brought this book. This book, Francis, as you can see, the book published in 1992, End of History and The Last Man. Ever since, a lot changed to the contrary of his prediction and to the contrary of a lot of us believe. Looks like coming into 21st century, we are witnessing revival of confrontation between democracy and autocracy. Before we begin, we will have some interesting question to all of you. The question is, do you think liberal democracy will survive 21st century? In Korean, 자유민주주의는 21세기를 살아남을 것인가? We had so using the QR code given to you, so you can participate, but you can enter only once. Of course, you can reply multiple times, but your latest one will count. So we'll allow some minute so that we can see your current thinking before we begin this session. How much you think will believe liberal democracy will survive 21st century? So as you think, right now we have 78% versus 25%. So I think in this room we are full of very optimistic, hopeful. I do not know quite sure this is some proper representative sample. So all right. So we have participants, as you can see, 59 replying. In this room, I think we have almost 150. So I will allow this number will grow as much as possible. So allow few minutes. And I think the dignitary in this head table, of course you can participate. Okay, so don't be afraid of and because it's anonymous. Right? So we'll have 69 participants. Well, I will count until 80. So we'll invite 10 more entry. So still we have optimist, 76 versus 26. So I think we have high chance. We have 75. So okay, 5 more. Yeah. 78. All right, 81, stop. Francis voted. I'm really curious what he voted. Okay, so as we stand in the beginning, we have 73% of people who participate. They believe liberal democracy will well and alive by the end of 21st century. On the other hand, 30% they expressed they are negative. Okay, so Francis, why don't you start on the topic of central liberal democracy? So your thought perspective.
Okay, I had some slides. If we can get the slide presentation up. So let me just begin. First of all, I want to congratulate KFAS, Korean Foundation for Advanced Study, for its 50-year anniversary. This is a tremendous achievement. We've spent the last couple of days with many of the beneficiaries and graduates of that program. It's a kind of amazing amount of intellectual capital that has been created by this foundation, and I think that all of you should be very proud of that accomplishment. So I was asked to talk about the last 50 years of democracy in the world. When I got to Korea, they told me, well, you should also talk about the next 50 years of democracy. I thought, that's an interesting challenge. I know a lot more about what happened in the last 50 years than I know about what's going to happen in the succeeding 50 years. So let me do a historical overview, and then Professor Choi and I will discuss some of the trends that we may see emerging over the next 50 years. But I imagine as you get out to the year 2075, things are going to be a little bit hazy. Now, when I advise my students to do PowerPoint presentations, I always tell them, don't put too many words on each slide. So I've been following my own advice. What I'm going to do is review each of the 5 decades up to this present moment in terms of the fate of liberal democracy. And the general pattern that I want to illustrate is that in each decade there have been good things and bad things happening. There's an overall pattern, but it's very hard to interpret from one decade to the next what's going to happen, because each decade may be dominated by setbacks to democracy, to greater tyranny, but then they always contain the seeds of something that may turn the situation around. By good and bad, I simply mean what I consider good is anything that expands human freedom, that creates the institutions of liberal democracy. What is bad is tyranny, authoritarian government, violations of basic human rights. And so that's the moral and normative framework that I want to operate in. And I want to go through each decade and just remind you of some of the things that were going on in each of these periods. There are a lot of students in the audience, and I lived through every one of these decades as an adult, but I realize that many of you were not born in these periods, and therefore may not have a great memory of exactly what things looked like in those years. So let me begin. I'm sorry, I thought that KFAS started in 75, and so each one of these periods is off by 1 year. But let's say 1974 to 1985, all right? That's the first decade. That was a bad decade. Many things went wrong in global politics at that time. There was a big war in the Middle East, the October War of 1973. There was an oil embargo imposed by OPEC. That oil embargo led to rapid price inflation in almost every country in the world. In developing countries, it led to a growing debt burden as governments tried to finance deficits through borrowing money from developed country banks. And in general, there was a enormous growth of inflation. Now, we're worried about inflation in the year 2024, but this is a period where you had 20%, 25% inflation in Europe, in the United States, and then you had hyperinflation in Latin America, many parts of sub-Saharan Africa. The United States in this period had just completed its withdrawal from Vietnam, and in something that may have been a prelude to the Afghan withdrawal, the South Vietnamese regime collapsed within 2 years of that withdrawal, and the communists won the war and took over the whole of Vietnam. Domestic politics in the United States did not look very good. We had a president, Richard Nixon, who used various American agencies to go after his political enemies. This was revealed in the Watergate scandal, which accelerated and led to the revelation of very serious illegality on the part of Nixon and his close associates, and eventually led to his resignation. If you think about other parts of the world, you had active guerrilla wars or civil wars going on in Central America, for example, in Guatemala, in El Salvador, in Nicaragua. And here in Asia, you had dictatorships that were running both South Korea and Taiwan. And then finally, in 1979, you had a really an event with enormous consequences, which was the Iranian Revolution, which for the first time put political Islam at the forefront of global political forces. It inspired Islamists in many other parts of the world and led to or increased the instability that already existed as a result of the Arab-Israeli conflict and other underlying political issues there. However, in that period, there are also some good things happening which people didn't recognize at the time. This was actually the beginning of what Samuel Huntington labeled the third wave of democratization. And so that wave began with the transitions to democracy in Southern Europe, in Spain and Portugal, after the death of Franco and the resolution of the Portuguese Civil War. It actually didn't look like a thing that would automatically happen, but because of the support that was given, for example, to the democratic forces in Portugal, that resulted not in a communist dictatorship, but in a liberal democracy. Turkey went through a similar transition to civilian rule in that period. And then probably the most consequential thing that occurred was the rise of Deng Xiaoping in China and the opening up and the liberalization of the Chinese economy that in many ways was the most monumental or led to the most monumental transition or economic change in the world in that period. Now, we move to the next period, 1985 to 1994, and all of a sudden the good things begin to outweigh the bad things in quite a remarkable way. At the end of the Vietnam War, Americans were very tired of their international commitments, and there was a lot of speculation that and honestly it was a defeat by the Vietnamese communists of the United States and of their allies, South Vietnam, would lead to a new period of American withdrawal and isolationism. And there's a brief moment when it looked like that may come true. But in 1980, you had the election of Ronald Reagan as president of the United States. I think that this shows that in many ways, foreign policy is really not determined by underlying forces, or it's not even particularly determined democratically. It really requires leadership. And you had in both the United States and in Britain, with the rise of Reagan and Thatcher, two leaders that were very confident about the strength of liberal democracy and the democratic ideas that underlay liberal democracy, and they were willing to project those ideas and defend them very vigorously out in the world. And President Reagan was also an internationalist. He did not want the United States to retreat from its international commitments, and in fact, he believed in free trade, he believed in the benefits of immigration, he believed in alliances, and the need to support democratic allies around the world. In this period, also in China, Deng Xiaoping began the household responsibility system. For the first time, Chinese citizens could start accumulating resources. They could keep the results of their labor. It had a miraculous effect on the Chinese economy. In my view, this kind of demonstrates the why capitalism actually works, because the moment that Chinese people were allowed to keep the fruits of their labor, they began to work harder and they began to get rich. And there was a huge transformation in the nature of the Chinese economy at that time. And then I don't need to tell you that this was the period of the transitions to democracy in both Korea and Taiwan, which seemed to endorse what we called modernization theory, that said that as a society became richer, as it grew a middle class, as there was a growing civil society, greater complexity in the nature of the society, that people would demand greater freedom, more political participation. And that is exactly what happened, because in both Taiwan and in South Korea, you had a civil society that began to demand greater openness and democratic government, and that was ultimately fulfilled in that period. There were some either bad or ambiguous developments that also occurred in this period. For example, in 1989, there was a takeover of the Grand Mosque in Saudi Arabia. Many people don't recognize this, but this was actually a very consequential development, because this is what led the Saudi government to then appease the reactionary Islamic clergy and forces in that country by projecting its brand of Salafism or Wahhabi Islam all over the world. And this is the period when they began building madrasas and other institutions all over the world, mostly in the Muslim world, but elsewhere as well, that would lay the grounds for a different kind of Islamic radicalism in the following decade. Tiananmen Square happened in 1989, as you're all aware, so the early liberalization of China did not lead to political democratization. It did lead to economic liberalism, but it did not lead to China emerging as a country like Taiwan and South Korea that actually held elections and could hold leaders accountable. The last issue I want to raise is the question of neoliberalism. This is a term, it's oftentimes used as a pejorative attack on capitalism per se, but that's not my definition of it. In my view, neoliberalism was a certain interpretation of market economics that tended to demonize the state and say that the state ought to stop being an obstacle to growth, that you needed to deregulate, you needed to privatize, and basically to weaken state sectors wherever possible. That was the way that it was interpreted by many policymakers in Washington and in Europe. And I would say that this is a very complicated development, because on the one hand, this is what permitted the growth of China and then later India to be major economic powerhouses. Without a liberal commitment to international trade, you could not have had the kind of rapid economic development, the pulling of people out of poverty, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in this period. On the other hand, like many good ideas, it was taken a little bit too far in many cases, and it began to lay the groundwork for some of the bad things that began to appear not in this decade, but in later decades. Okay, let's move on to the next decade. So this, in a way, was the best decade in terms of the growth of democracy. You had, let's just begin with Europe. You had the institutionalization of the European Union in this period. The Maastricht Treaty was signed, the euro was created, and what had been a free trade area basically sought to evolve into an institution that could act independently on the world stage, more powerfully in economic policy than in foreign policy, but nonetheless, Europe began to take on a distinct character with its own kind of agency in world politics, and it was an institution that was based on a commitment to certain human rights and human values that were very much in line with the spread of global democracy. You had actually the peak, I think, of liberal self-confidence in this period. You may remember that there is something called the duty to protect, or the responsibility to protect, which said not only are we going to safeguard human rights and liberal values in our own countries, but when we see them being threatened in other places, we are going to, if necessary, use military force to uphold them. That didn't work so well in Rwanda, but it, in a sense, was embodied in the NATO intervention in the war between Serbia and Kosovo, in which the freedom of the Kosovars and the nation of Kosovo was created as a result of direct intervention by the other democracies in Europe. You had, after Tiananmen, a turn in China. Deng Xiaoping took his southern tour. There was worry after Tiananmen that China would then return to a form of authoritarian government, but Deng indicated his continuing commitment to liberal economic principles, and the country China continued to grow very rapidly throughout this entire period. Now, the bad parts in this decade really had to do with macroeconomics and the global economy, because you had the beginning of a number of financial crises. And these crises, so this was the sterling crisis in '92, the Mexican crisis in the Asian financial crisis really was the, not the peak, but you know, the manifestation of this in this part of the world. It was directly related to the kinds of neoliberal policies that had been implemented primarily in the United States, but also to some degree in Europe, basically the deregulation of the financial sector. So this was a period in which the advice coming from the IMF, from the US Treasury to developing countries was to open your capital markets, let liquidity flow in, because this would, market forces would direct it to the most productive means, and economic growth would be stimulated. What they didn't realize was that that kind of liquidity and the trillions of dollars sloshing around the global economy proved to be extremely destabilizing. It went into East Asia in the early 1990s, but then at the first sign of trouble, and I don't have to tell anybody in Korea this history, at the first sign of trouble, it came rushing out again and proved to be highly destabilizing to not just the economies, which went into a tailspin, but also to the politics of the entire region. And then you had September 11th coming right in the middle of this decade, where it was clear that there was resistance to this liberal international order that was being created, that there were many people left outside of it that resented the domination of the West and of Western ideas. They did not have armored divisions and tanks, but they did have people that were willing to sacrifice their lives in the name of an Islamic ideology. And so you had, you know, in a way, the worst part of it was not the September 11th attacks themselves, which were bad enough, but it was the reaction by the United States to those attacks that I think proved then to be extremely destabilizing, because those attacks led directly to the invasions of both Afghanistan and Iraq by the US, the overthrow of the governments there, and then the inability of the United States and of American foreign policy to create stable, legitimate state institutions that could take over the control of those territories. And so the United States found itself stuck. Its military forces were needed to maintain any basic level of political order in both countries, and the United States did not do well at this in this process. We realized that actually before you can have a democracy, you had to have a working state, and we had really no idea how to create a state that had any kind of legitimacy or sustainability. So we now move to closer to the present, the decade from 2005 to 2014. You had a continuing deterioration of the liberal order with the rise and the consolidation of autocratic governments in Russia and China. The Russian rise really was marked a little bit earlier in 2008 with its invasion of Georgia, which the West did not react to. This was a period when President Obama characterized Russia as a regional power, not a great power, not a superpower. That phrase just in itself, I think, was a big stimulus to Vladimir Putin to prove that Obama was wrong, that Russia was not just a regional power, but was one that was capable of projecting its power in various ways around the world. You had the rise of China, and then at the end of this period, a very consequential event, which was the selection of Xi Jinping as the Secretary General of the Chinese Communist Party, the President of China. I think that prior to Xi's election, certainly a lot of my Chinese friends were hoping that the next leader of China would actually liberalize the country, not necessarily democratize it, but make it more open, continue the trends that Deng Xiaoping had begun. But instead, you had a leader that seemed to have a nostalgia for Mao and Maoism and began to clamp down on dissent, increase discipline on the Chinese Communist Party and on the Chinese people as a whole. So that brings us up to the present, in which I think a lot of the seeds that were planted in the decades that looked like democracy was doing well grew up into rather poisonous plants. So the inequality that had been created by the liberal globalization that had been pushed by the United States and many international institutions in the 1990s, it turns out, left a lot of people behind in terms of ordinary working class people that did not benefit equally from globalization. It destabilized economies by removing financial regulations and led to, the whole period up until the early 1990s had not seen a single major financial crisis since the whole Bretton Woods system was put in place, but then virtually every year in the years after that, you did have a major financial crisis. In this period, you had the rise of populism, which in a sense was the most surprising outcome of the prior periods, where you had both economic inequality and cultural resentment on the part of people who felt that they had lost status or were disrespected, began to organize, began to become an active political force precisely in the most democratic parts of the world. In the United States, in Britain, the year 2016, I think, was a surprise to many people that had become very complacent about the stability and the security of liberal democracy with the British vote to leave the European Union, Brexit, and then the election of Donald Trump in 2016. And in a certain way, we are still recovering from that. Or not recovering, I wouldn't say that we've recovered, we're still dealing with that populist challenge. And this is what makes this period a little bit different, in my view, from the period of the Cold War, where you also had a division between democracy and autocracy. The difference, I think, is the deep-rootedness of populism in the populations and in the voters of many advanced liberal democracies, particularly in the United States. In the United States during the Cold War, we had a communist party. It was always very marginal. You had, extreme right-wing groups like the John Birch Society, but These were all successfully marginalized by the mainstream political parties. They never played a serious role in the politics of the United States. That's not true now. One of our two major parties has been taken over by a group of pretty fanatical people on the extreme right who, in a sense, have undermined the understanding of American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism was a long-standing term describing the way that Americans thought about themselves. Generally speaking, well, our teacher, Larry Diamond, teacher and mine, Seymour Martin Lipset, who is the authority on American exceptionalism, always said it was a double-edged sword. America was exceptionally good in certain ways, but it was also exceptionally bad in other ways, that we may have had more innovation and people like Steve Jobs willing to break norms and rules in order to innovate, but we also had a much higher crime rate than any other liberal democracy. But that understanding of America as a model for other countries around the world to follow, was part of the American self-understanding. If you look at the American dollar bill, there's this Masonic symbol, the Great Pyramid with the all-seeing eye, that has the Latin inscription that says, New Order of the Ages, which in a way was the way that Americans had thought about their own system with regard to the rest of the world, that they were the vanguard of a democratic revolution that would eventually encompass all of mankind. And that understanding, that self-understanding, came to be challenged in this latest period. And then, of course, at the end of it, you had the invasion of Ukraine, you had the return of geopolitics and the return to the open violation of the borders of sovereign nations through the use of armed force, which is something that many people in the earlier decades had thought had been banished from global politics. So that's 5 decades. You had a rise. I guess the lessons I would draw from this are the following. We may be tempted to think that we are in a uniquely unstable period when the threats to democracy are greater than they've been in history. And I think if you look back, that's not necessarily true. Things looked pretty bad in the 1970s. And in the 1960s, if you go back even further, regimes were overthrown by military coups all over Latin America, all over sub-Saharan Africa, and you had a combination of political instability with economic crisis that affected the lives of many, many ordinary people. So I'm not sure that our present age is uniquely bad in terms of the backsliding and the assaults on democracy, although there are certain respects in which that's true. What I would note is that each decade may have had a master narrative, right? So you had crisis of democracy and the global economy in the 1970s, then you had the revival of democracy in the 1980s and 1990s, the spread of liberal ideas around the world, and then setbacks coming in the decades of the 2000s. And I think that among other things, indicates it's really hard to make predictions, that there may be small signs of things going on that may metastasize like a cancer and drag us into a worse position, but you can also see things that may actually be the seeds of a revival of democratic ideas into the future. For example, artificial intelligence. Right now we've been conditioned to be very afraid of new technologies, I think largely because of our experience with social media and the internet. I should have mentioned that. The privatization of the internet in the 1990s was one of those developments that at the time looked extremely promising, but then as time went on, came to be seen as more and more threatening to democratic values. And I think something similar is going on with artificial intelligence. We just don't know what the impact is going to be. I can make arguments in both directions for why this is going to be either disastrous or actually helpful to liberal democracy. And it's one of the big uncertainties, I think, that's facing the world at the present moment. All right, so I told you I was asked to talk about the last 50 years. I have some opinions about the next 50 years, but maybe we can turn to a dialogue over that.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Francis, for such a oversweeping guiding back to past 50 years. I think we need to utilize remaining time to project what next 50 years ahead of us. In this room, we have many citizens and young fellows who will live through the next 50 years. Well, some of the things, while you're declaring end of history, obviously populism was not your mind, generation divide was not your mind, even gender divide not your mind, and demography challenge not your mind. And those are challenges we are going through. So putting in a Korean context, what is quite surprising, in many countries where liberal democracies are being exercised, there's a huge gender divide among young generation, meaning that 20-something and 30-something. So what is the implication that for working of liberal democracy now and future in Korean context and also global context?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. The third book I wrote was a book called The Great Disruption, which was probably the least read of all the books I've written. But in many ways, it was the one that really tried to grapple with that particular question. So one of the huge social changes that took place really over this 50-year period that I just described was the entry of literally hundreds of millions of women into workforces, primarily in developed countries, but also in less developed countries in that period, and a very, very distinct change in the nature of families and in the nature of gender relations. The argument that I made in The Great Disruption was that this was not an ideological matter. It's not as if it suddenly occurred to some women that they were feminists and that they had to push for women's rights, on some abstract theoretical grounds. I think it was really driven by economic change. In this period, beginning in the 1960s, you were moving from an industrial economy to a post-industrial economy. And in a post-industrial economy, women have a much larger role in the workforce. Upper body strength is simply not as important in a workplace where everybody is sitting behind a computer screen. And so it wasn't just a change in consciousness that drove this massive change in the nature of labor. It was really the development of machines, of computers, of the rise of an information economy. And so this is something that it's been a little slower in some countries than in others. In Scandinavia, it went very quickly. In Southern Europe, a little bit less quickly, and so forth. But it is, I think, an inevitable consequence of the nature of work. And one of the biggest, in a way, challenges, not just for democracies, but for autocracies, is the fact that in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iran, many very conservative Muslim countries, they are educating more women than they are men. More young people are going to college and getting university educations, more women than men. And that has got to have a long-term social impact on the nature of those societies. And I think that normatively, this was a necessary and important shift that happened, but the adjustment process and the backlash against it has been very great. And so we talked about this yesterday in our discussion, that you have a lot of conservative movements, right-wing movements all over the world that are driven by angry young men. And they're angry because their status in society, where their fathers and grandfathers were seen as the primary breadwinners in their families, has changed, and now they're being displaced by women. And they blame this on feminism, on certain ideas, non-traditional ideas, but fundamentally it is driven by the nature of work and the way that technology has affected work, and it's not going to change. It's simply not going to change. And in fact, in many respects, those changes are going to sink deeper roots. It means that family structure is going to be different. It's had this big effect on fertility rates because educated women simply are not willing to have 7, 8, 9 children the way their grandmothers perhaps were. So in a way, I'm not quite sure how to answer the question of what implication this has for democracy, because that adjustment economically is going to be an extremely difficult one to make.
Well, the question I was inclined to ask to you is because despite those astonishing achievements, especially in Korea and Taiwan and Japan, which is a latecomer in democracy, it seems to me, once they reach certain peak, it's quite obvious they fail to embark on more fundamental, reform, such as reflecting, all this work participation, demographic change, technology change. So, that is creating some perception in many people in the world why liberal democracy failed to come up with some more effective speed delivery of some social issues compared with non-democratic countries.
Well, I don't think that there's that difference in performance. I mean, if you think about changes in family structure and the role of women in the workforce, China is suffering from exactly the same problems as Japan and Korea. They also have a rapidly declining fertility rate. They also are going to have huge problems supporting, through pensions, their older populations. And in fact, they made their situation worse because they're an autocracy. The one-child policy is not something that any liberal democracy would have attempted to impose on its population, but the Chinese Communist Party, because it's a dictatorship, could do that, and as a result, they're suffering from, in a way, a worse demographic situation.
Well, there were some questions, I think there's common question from the audience who were asking basically, to defend a liberal democratic value, how fast they can go. For instance, in Korea, as you can see, this is one of very vibrant democracy. In any given day, you can see a lot of interesting demonstration rallies are happening, right? And so basically they are shouting out and they want to have their concern to be heard. But on the other hand, that is going to disrupting some very stable delivery of some public transportation service and so on and so forth. So there is a perception liberal democracy means liberal democracy means smaller government, smaller state, and government supposed not to do something quite strong. But on the other, autocracy is quite opposite. So that is going to generate another very dangerous perception. It is better to live in under
China.
Stable government. I'm not naturally alluding to China, something like that. So question is, to defend liberal value, how far state can go?
So this is another problem that I have with so-called neoliberalism, because it seems to me that having strong, effective government could easily be part of, a liberal democracy. That liberal democracy is not the same as libertarianism. Libertarians don't want the state to do anything. They want low taxes. They want the state to stay out of the economy, out of society, and so forth. But I think that in a way is it's a malformed understanding of liberalism, because liberal states need strength. They need to be able to implement and enforce the policies that they set for themselves. And if you look back in history, liberal democracies did a much better job at this sort of thing than they are doing now. For example, we're all of us Stanford people come from the Bay Area or from the southwest of the United States. The United States built the Golden Gate Bridge, the Oakland Bay Bridge, and Hoover Dam, all three of these massive projects that any Chinese infrastructure builder would be, envious of, and they did it in the space of 4 years. And this was done under, a democratically elected president who, simply created the consensus to counter the depression by engaging in these massive projects. And I think that it's not possible today to do something like that because of the accumulation of procedural requirements to really do anything big on that kind of scale. And I think that means that there's an agenda ahead of us to streamline government, not to make it like China, but to make it more like it used to be, 50 years ago. I think that you can still be a liberal democracy that respects individual rights, that is democratically legitimated, that can also accomplish things. And in fact, I think one of the reasons that there's a populist backlash and unhappiness with democracy is precisely the fact that it is not delivering these kinds of outcomes.
Well, can you talk a bit about the other side of liberal democracy? So they're saying liberal democracy will not be sustainable without very effective capitalist market economy. And so the natural corollary is, if you look at the case of Taiwan and Japan, all they have associated with liberal market economy thriving and liberal democracy, so to speak. But the case in point is China. So can you tell us the future of China? Because a lot of people they were betting on economic liberalization will lead to some sort of political liberalization, which hasn't happened. So can you still wait in the next 50 years?
So I'm not convinced that modernization theory is dead and it will never be vindicated in China. At the moment, it looks like China is a big counterexample because, when it hit whatever it is, about 12,000 PPP, per capita income, same point at which Taiwan and Korea democratized, they actually became more autocratic. So it's a big, contradiction to modernization theory. The thing is that democratization is dependent on a lot of different variables, not all of which are related to the economy. And I think that means that every country is going to find a different path to democracy. And it's not impossible that at some future date, actually modernization theory will prove true because all these well-educated middle-class Chinese are, the moment their government starts disappointing them, the way it did under zero COVID, the legitimacy of that, model may change. I actually think that looking around the economic models today, in a way, it really does vindicate the fundamental capitalist principles that underlie a market economy. Why is China slowing down right now? Well, part of it is that as a middle-income country, it's hitting this middle-income trap that many other countries have faced, but they are suffering precisely from the autocratic nature of decision-making. After the financial crisis in 2008, the Chinese government responded by pouring a huge amount of subsidy into the housing sector and into infrastructure. And they are paying for that, they have not gotten out of the crisis that was the result of that kind of overinvestment. One interesting activity, is to go on YouTube and search for videos of Chinese apartment complexes being dynamited, because there's a lot of them that indicate the wasted capital that was a result of this policy. Xi Jinping has gone after his tech sector, the most productive part, and he has chosen, in order to get out of the current slowdown in the Chinese economy, what I regard as the absolutely wrong set of policies. He should be investing in social security, in better education for Chinese people living in the interior of China, in more education, especially in those rural areas. And instead, he wants to go back to export-driven growth in a manufacturing economy, in a world that is simply not going to accept, that many Chinese imports. They're just not going to. We've already seen this big shift in the United States, 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs. And so I think that really in the long run, autocracy is not good for Chinese capitalism.
Well, I'm afraid you are afraid of making bet. Can you talk just a little bit about democracy? Demography. because we in Korea's and according to recent data, known as the country which is recording and breaking record after record to be the lowest fertility rate. And also, Japan is not quite different. So those, two liberal democracies in Korea, economic powerhouse, they're undergoing inevitable demography decline. At the same time, the huge reservoir of aging citizens. I think in relation to our early discussion, gender divide, especially young generation, I think this is not, the good for future thriving democracy. I'm afraid this may lead to some, warfare between generations, what to do with the pension, what to do with labor reform. Also, when you consider logjam in relation to coming effective policy making. So, is it quite really bad for the future prospect?
Well, the world has experienced declining population, but in the past that's always been the result of an epidemic or war. So it is possible to recover from a situation where you lose 50% of your male population, but it's not a very pleasant, it's not a very pleasant prospect. I think that realistically, so you have to have a theory about why fertility is declining, and I think that you've seen the biggest fertility declines in societies where you have large numbers of educated women, but a social structure that retains a lot of patriarchal values. And in that situation, women rebel by not having children or not, like in Japan, not wanting to get married because they don't want to be put in a situation where their university education is going to, taking care of their husband's parents and that sort of thing. And so I think that, there is a solution to that, which is basically a form of social democracy. You have to provide, state-supported childcare. You have to, make the path for women going back into the labor force after they've had children easier. And that's not, in many parts of East Asia, it's not that easy to do that.
I think we are almost coming to an end. I have a couple of some interesting questions need to ask to you. I think this person seems like college students. They are asking, in Korean society we have ongoing debate. While Korea has achieved certain economic success, now we have created our own quite affluent, wealthy middle class, and they are very serious to defend the economic status and take advantage of whatever they can. So that is creating huge national debate, fairness. But from those establishment perspective, what they're doing is based on their merit. Okay, so how can you have some effective balancing act between meritocracy and fairness while we are maintaining liberal democracy?
Well, I'm hesitant to give a lot of advice on Korea itself because I don't understand the actual economic and social conditions here. I would say that you've got a general problem in democracies that precisely because they are democratic, they tend to accumulate entrenched interest groups that are largely interested in preserving the status quo. The economist Mansur Olson, he should have won a Nobel Prize, but he died, too early for that. But he wrote this book, The Rise and Decline of Nations, in which he argued that especially rich countries go through this cycle that they accumulate too many interest groups that then make the society too rigid. And unfortunately, it takes war, revolution, some kind of huge upheaval to displace those interest groups so that you can start over again with a more even playing field. That's a rather pessimistic analysis, but I think that it is the case that you do have this problem of incumbent groups that have done well in the past that don't want to give up their position. That's why we can't build affordable housing in California. So it's not just a Korean problem. What's the solution for that? Well, I don't know, war, revolution, that's what Mansur Olson suggested, but I don't think those are very attractive,
Well, looks like we are
policies.
arriving very gloomy prospect without war, revolution, impossible to start on clean slate. So, well, we always, I tend to believe, people's remarkable capability to adapt to situations.
I would say the one thing that Mansur Olson didn't talk about is basically competition and the rise of new groups, right? And because of the changes in technology, that's been happening continually. I mean, this is just one more point I'll make about the gender transition. A lot of people blame information technology for increasing inequality, and there's no question that it rewards high levels of education, right? If you're a programmer, you got a much better chance of getting a high-paying job than if you're a bricklayer or something. But what people don't recognize is that if I'm right about the information revolution empowering women in the workplace, it was one of the biggest boons to gender equality of any development, and it was completely exogenous. I mean, the nature of technology and the nature of work just changed, and it gave a lot of women a lot of opportunity. And so I think that this pessimism about technological advance can easily be overdone, because it could also empower more competition and more social mobility.
Well, I'll give a final, very short question, so respond in very short way. Among many challenges we are confronting today, what do you think is single most serious challenge which will risk future navigation of liberal democracy?
Well, look, I don't think this just reflects the fact that I'm an American, but I want to survive the November election, frankly. I think that if we make the wrong choice next November, it's going to be very bad, not just for democracy in the United States, but it's going to be bad globally. Like they say, you can't get to the long term unless you survive the short term, and that's what I'm focused on.
So that will create a natural linkage to our next session, okay? Before we conclude, going back to the very first poll I gave to you, could you take out your smartphones and can you run the same questions? Now after session with Francis FUKUYAMA, what is your answer? Have you changed your answer from yes to no or no to yes? So we have only 2 responses, so I wish that response will go up. So now we have 15, so yeah. So we have 37 respondents, yeah. I think people are getting more pessimistic as of now. Well, being pessimistic doesn't mean we are doomed, right? We are really realizing what kind of tumultuous conditions we are going through. So we're 55. Previously, we had, I remember, 80 to 20 or something like that, right? But now, 68 to 32. So I will invite 11 more. We have now 69, 70 respondents. Yeah. Right, stop. 71 versus 29. So as you can see, after 1 hour session with Francis, more people become, I cannot say more, a little bit more. They changed their mind, but that doesn't mean we are doomed. Still, we are more hopeful side. So with that, I will conclude first session with Francis. Thank you very much. Thank you.